Of our human relations course chapter on conflict and labor unions. So the topics on this, what I expect to be a little bit longer video, is about labor unions. So firstly, be able to discuss the history of labor unions, and then secondly, explain some of the reasons for a decline in union membership in the United States over the past 60 or so years. And then lastly, be able to explain the process of unionization and laws that relate to labor unions in the United States. So, what are labor unions? Well, there's a good chance that maybe you or somebody you know or will know have been in a labor union or will be in a labor union. In these labor unions, we are expecting to have a lot of need for the human relation skills that we are learning about throughout this chapter, because it is all about conversations and negotiations between management and the labor union. So a labor union is a group of workers who band together to meet some common goals. And generally, those goals involve making it better for the employees within that organization. Things such as better pay, benefits, promotion rules, policies, etc. Labor unions started in the 1800s because at that point, the employer had the power. It had shifted to the power because unions or the workers did not have as many skills, so they had to unionize because of that power imbalance. Employees were often treated unfairly and they were underpaid, working many hours, many days a week. And today, which is, over a century later, current union challenges include a decline in membership, which we have seen here in the United States over the decades, and also globalization. So we have a flat world where organizations are working and doing business across borders. So the history and organization of unions. So we have a couple of pretty dense slides. But trade unions, labor unions, started in Europe around the Industrial Revolution, when employees really didn't have many skills. And as we said on the prior slide, the power was sitting with the employer, with the organization. And with that power shift, workers were treated very unfairly and they were underpaid. In the United States, we saw unionization starting around the building of the railroads in the late 1860s. Wages and pay in that industry was really low, and the threat of injury or death was quite high, which is also true in many manufacturing facilities where there were no safety laws, no safety regulations in place, and so people were frequently injured. And because of this, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers started, and also several other brotherhoods, and they were focused on specific tasks such as conductors or brakesmen. But they came together, they banded together to protect workers and to make that worker rights were defended, so to speak. At that point in time, many workers were fired because of their union membership, which is not something companies can do today. Then in 1866, the National Labor Union was formed, and that paved the greater way for other labor organizations. And they had a little bit of a different goal. They wanted to form a national labor federation so they could lobby the government. So they wanted reforms on behalf of labor organization. And their first big task was to limit the workday to 8 hours. So we can thank the NLU for our standard work hour of 8 hours today for the workday. Unfortunately, that organization actually excluded Chinese workers, African Americans, and female workers did not really have many rights within the NLU. And so it didn't stay around for very, very long. And what came after was the Knights of Labor in the 1880s. And they formed to make a push for collective bargaining rather than government legislation. So the Knights of Labor started as a fraternal organization, and they grew in popularity after NLU had dissolved. They started really for coal miners, but they were also covering a lot of other industries. And they had a lot of success early on because they initiated some strikes that were successful in making sure that they got increased pay, increased benefits, and of course that will attract employees to the union because that means that they have a better situation back at work. After some more unsuccessful strikes, unfortunately, their membership started declining. And these strikes were not so successful because there was like internal turmoil within the Knights organization. They didn't really have great organization, they didn't have good management, it was very autocratic. So the organization was not run very well. So it was internal conflicts that really created the demise of the Knights of Labor. After that, we saw AFL, the American Federation of Labor, that was formed in 1886. And this was really people who wanted to see a shift away from the Knights of Labor and how they did business. Here, the focus was on higher wages and job security. They did not have that sort of infighting that we saw with the Knights of Labor. And so they had a much stronger, well-run organization that we still have around today. Then in the 1930s, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, was formed because there were some political differences within the AFL. However, later on in the 1950s, the two unions did join together. And so today we have AFL-CIO, which is currently, today in the United States, the largest federation of unions. It is made up of about 56 national as well as international unions. And their goal isn't so much to negotiate specific contracts for employees, but rather to support efforts of local unions throughout the country. So currently here in the United States, we have two main national labor unions that oversee several industry-specific local unions. And so we have a number of different independent, national, and international unions, such as the Change to Win Federation, that has the Teamsters, the Service Employees International Union, United Farm Workers, etc., etc. We also have the AFL-CIO that has the airlines, the Federation of Government Employees, Associated Actors, etc. And then a lot of independent unions, such as those representing police, pilots, Major League Baseball players, etc. National unions play an important role when it comes to the national level of legislation, while the local unions focus more on collective bargaining and making sure the contracts that are in place regarding salaries, wages, benefits, policies, promotions, trainings, etc. Are negotiated on behalf of employees locally. Local unions also typically have a union steward, and this is a person working for the organization that has been elected by the union to represent the union members in that organization. So for some of the national union actions that we see, they typically do some of the following. They lobby the government for worker rights laws to make sure that we have legislation in place for protection. They resolve disputes between unions that occur occasionally. They also help organize national protests, as well as work with allied organizations and sponsors for various programs that will support the unions. We also have several acts or laws, legislations that have been put in place over the years that relate somehow to our labor unions. And so this slide lists 5 of them. So firstly, we have the Railway Labor Act, which was passed in 1926. And this one covers railroads and airlines. and they have been put in place so we can have interstate communications, and that will not be disrupted. So the RLA is administered by the National Mediation Board, and they outline very specifically how these organizations can come to dispute resolution, because they cannot just strike at will, because it can't be disrupted. Then we have the Noyes-LaGuardia Act from 1932, which is a result of yellow dog contracts. And so this act actually barred federal courts from issuing injunctions against non-violent labor disputes. This one is also known as the Anti-Injunction Bill. The Wagner Act from 1935 allowed for joining a union without interference, eliminating discrimination against union members, and set collective bargaining rules. So here we have worker freedom to join a union, and we have that right if we want to, and the organization cannot interfere with that. This one is sometimes called the NLRA, National Labor Relations Act, very important. Then we have the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which amended the Wagner Act, and it focused on unfair acts by the union. So while we have said, while acts and laws in the past had said that management cannot act unfairly, the Taft-Hartley came into place that neither can the union. The union cannot act unfairly either. Then we have Landrum-Griffin from 1959 that requires unions to hold secret elections and to report their finances. And this came about because there was racketeering and corruption within unions. So no longer should that be happening, because now all the unions have to report finances, and all the elections for unions to be in place are secret. So how do we go about unionizing? If you are with an employer that doesn't have a union and we want to be unionized, this is the process. It typically starts with, at the top here, with some level of dissatisfaction. So employees are not feeling that they're getting their salaries, their wages. Maybe they feel that they are having their rights violated. And so the union can either contact the employees, or the employees can contact the union. So there's two different ways this can get started. And then there's some initial conversation, right? So initial meetings with the union to discuss what is going on with the situation. So initial organization. Number 3 is to collect signatures. And there must be at least 30% of the employees that sign for this unionization process to move forward. And in the 4th step, there is a secret ballot election, and that happens after those 30% of signatures has been gathered. And there needs to be a secret ballot election, and it's administered by the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. And then lastly, if the vote is yes, right, and there's a 51% majority, the National Labor Relations Board will certify the union as the legal bargaining representative of the employees. And so what happens during unionization process? We have some things that cannot be done or said. So companies cannot threaten, essentially. They cannot threaten to shut down. They cannot threaten employees from gathering. They cannot prevent them from joining the union. They cannot question employees about the union. And so we cannot threaten to discharge or punish or terminate. We cannot threaten layoffs, loss of jobs or benefits, etc., etc. So the organization is told to stay out of the unionization process, because employees have the right to unionize in the United States. This graph is a screenshot from your textbook, and it just essentially shows that we are no longer very unionized. In the United States, we tend to hover around 10% or so, and it has been declining steadily. Some of the more manufacturing heavy industries are more unionized than others, right? We don't see tech being unionized very often, although Amazon workers did try to unionize, and it has been in the news. It wasn't quite successful, but that is a very interesting story to follow. Also, male dominated occupations and older employees tend to be more unionized than younger employees. So, what are the strategies that companies use sometimes to avoid unionizations? Well, most organizations might feel that it's too constraining to have a union because it really affects how they can run the organization. So it might have a cost to the organization, and it might be more costly because employees get greater pay, maybe greater vacation, maybe greater benefits, and operationally it might not be as efficient. And also collective bargaining, of course, can put management at odds with the employees, so it might be a conflict situation, which might be very costly. So they might want to make sure that unionization doesn't happen. But as we saw on the prior slide, there is not very much that they can do about that. So some of the arguments that might be used include talking with the employee and saying things like, well, the union dues are very costly and they can force you to go on a strike, and we can't just talk informally anymore after you are unionized. Unionization can also create more bureaucracy within the company, and individual issues that could be important to you might not be discussed. And in many instances, decisions that sit with the union, such as how much vacation time you get, are based on things such as seniority versus performance. So while there are trade-offs, there are also some benefits. So that is what the company tries to get at, is to point out the disadvantages that may occur when you join a union. Of course, if you are in an organization where management really cares about their employees and provides benefits and salaries so that all employees are taken care of, there isn't really a need for a union. We need unions in organizations that don't really care about their employees. But of course, these organizations tend to be opposed to unions, as we said on the prior page, because union workers tend to make more money, which is more costly, obviously, for the organization. And having a union does limit the ability of managers to run the organization exactly the way they want to run it, because management needs to negotiate with the union to make sure that employees are represented fairly in that negotiation. So, for your exercise, go ahead and visit the National Labor Relations Board website and look at their weekly case summary. See what they are saying and discuss it in at least a couple of paragraphs stating what your opinion on the case is. Do you agree with unionization? Here in number 2. Why or why not? List the advantages and disadvantages of unions to the employees and to the company, because they are different. So in summary, union memberships in the US has been declining. Today, union memberships consist of about 10.5% of the workforce. The reasons for union decline are varied. Some people say moving job overseas is the reason, and other people say unions' hardline tactics have put them out of favor. Maybe it's also because employees are starting to care more about their employees, right? Union challenges include globalization and companies wanting union-free workplace. The US began its first labor movement in the 1800s as a result of low wages, no vacation time, safety issues, and other big problems. Legislation has been created over time to support both labor unions and the companies that have labor unions. To form a union, the organizer must have signatures from at least 30% of the employees. And if that happens, the National Labor Relations Board will facilitate a card check to determine more than 50% of the workforce at the company agrees with union representation. If the company does not accept the card check process, the National Labor Relations Board will hold a secret election to determine if the employees will be unionized. A collective bargaining agreement is put in place if the vote is a yes by a majority of 51%. Companies prefer to not have unions in their organizations because it affects cost and can impact operational efficiency. And they will also try to prevent a union from organizing in the workplace because of that. Managers are impacted when a company does unionize because management rights are impacted, and everything must be guided by the union contract instead of management prerogative. So with that, we are going to call it quits, and I will see you for the next one. Take care. See you soon. Be safe.